Welcome to episode 300 of the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you gentlemen would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hello, I am David Gehlke, author of the new Scott Burns Sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997.
Hi, I'm Scott Burns, and I'm David's buddy, and he wrote the book, and yeah, Adrian, thanks. We're going to talk about it.
Thank you guys for joining me for this very special episode. We'll start with David. In addition to writing this book with Scott, about Scott, you've also written a number of books in the last few years about Paradise Lost, Obituary, Noise Records. You're also a contributor to Decibel magazine, and I believe in the past you worked for Metal Maniacs, right?
Correct. Right now, I do most of my work for Blabbermouth, actually, but yes, Scott's book is my fourth. Yes.
Okay. And if anybody listening to this podcast does not know who Scott Burns is, I think you should go. I think you're in the wrong place. Just a little bit of backstory. You know, Scott asked me to tell him a little bit about myself before we started. And, you know, for me, it starts in 94 when I heard a band from Brazil called Sepultura for the first time. And they quickly became my favorite band. And in tracking down their earlier albums, I got Beneath the Remains and Arise, and it led me down a path to, you know, much heavier, much more underground music. Scott, tell me if any of these bands sound familiar to you. Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Napalm Death, Gorguts. Are you familiar with any of these bands, Scott?
I am. They were awesome, and I am lucky enough that they came and recorded with me back in the, late 80s, early 90s, and yeah, they were killer, and yes, they were great bands, and the greatness of them is they're still around today even without me. So it just proves that they were really great bands that have nothing to do with me, but I was lucky enough to record them. So, yes.
Well, I think as David can attest to, Scott is being incredibly humble right now.
No.
I would make the argument that they are around today because of you and because of the work that you did on those albums.
If you buy David's book, I was lucky enough to record a lot of bands, a lot of great bands, a lot of good bands, and a lot of bands that still aren't around. And I love them all. They're like my kids. But I will say this is, honestly, Adrian, that those bands are still great because they are great. Did I contribute in the beginning? We can talk about that. Like, most people thought death metal was shit back in the day.
Oh, I remember.
So I get that. And they weren't into it.
Did you ask if it was okay? Did you ask if it was okay to swear on this, Scott?
Sorry, David. Yeah, is that okay?
I don't think Adrian minds.
I believe Chuck Schuldiner had a catchphrase, right? Let it ride, Metal Brother.
Yeah, that's right.
Let it flow, Metal Brother. Let it flow, right? That's what he said to Scott all the time.
Metal Brother, let it flow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my philosophy, Scott. Let it flow.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen. I think I helped them in the beginning, like I said, but the main thing back in the day was, there wasn't a lot of people who were into extreme metal or underground metal. And so for that, I guess, yes, maybe I can take some credit. But at the same time these bands are still around today, still making music, still touring, still doing quite well. Some, arguably some are doing better than they were. And so I think you have to say those bands were great, and I was lucky to be a part of them.
to counterpoint, I butt in is, sort of what Adrian was going back to, is that the combination of the songs, which Scott is definitely right about, a lot of those bands in the early days wrote great songs, but it took a special sort of engineer, and Scott will definitely hit upon this soon, as will I, was a great studio as well, which was more a sound recording. And without all of those things, it was sort of like convergence of all these great things happening at once. It was like lightning in a bottle. It's probably something we will never see again. There will likely never be a studio that was ground zero for all these things happening, for a style of music and a producer like Scott and a group of engineers like the Morris brothers or Rick Miller. They're building the technology and helping the bands and helping Scott along the way. All those things led to those albums that Adrian, you had mentioned, by Sepultura, Obituary, Death, Cannibal Corpse, Napalm. That's what helped make them all legendary. And because they were all so great early on, that's what helped prolong their careers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, David. And to chime in on that is that, back in the day, and you touch upon it in the book, is that, look, most of the stuff, I mean, once you got really fast, Jim, Tom, and Rick, and we can listen. I didn't record them, Tom did, but you can throw in there Morbid Angel. So you really cover like most of the great death metal bands, right? And he did them. But like I said, is they built that studio, and and Dan Johnson, like you touch upon in the book, with the Whiplash, Damage, Sabotage, obviously Nasty Savage was around, but there was, Jim and Tom and Rick built something where there was a great studio. And once again, like I said, in the book, we talk about, like, I went to other studios, they all sucked. And but that really helped because, the old records, nothing to say anything against them, great records, but, Possessed, or even the first, Scream Bloody Gore. Nothing against Randy. It sounded better, but not great. But, Dark, a lot of that stuff didn't sound that good. As far as what, production wise, what I considered like were great sounding metal records or great sounding rock records where it had great production. And I think for the death metal guys, I was young enough, came from the punk background, is that a lot of people just blew it off and said it's fast, it's fucking, the vocals are fucking some dog barking, and they blew it off. But like I said, as David said, is that, it was, convergence of the studio. I guess me, because I was younger and I was into extreme stuff. Like I said, Jim, Tom, and Rick. And throw in there Dan Johnson. It was the perfect storm, or whatever, as you say, but that's it.
I want to talk a little bit about how the two of you first got in touch and decided to collaborate on this book.
Yeah, I can go, because Adrian, what Scott did to you when we kicked off this call is basically what he did to me when we were doing the obituary book. So when I was asked...
People listening to this podcast won't hear the exchange that I had with Scott, but Scott Scott inquired to my background and about myself for a bit before we actually started the podcast. I think, David, in the book you mentioned that Scott throws interviewers off by asking them about themselves, which is definitely a change of...
Yep, that's a Scott Burns trademark. Yeah. So when I was asked to do the obituary book a few years ago, Scott, of course, is one of the main interview subjects. And the first time Scott and I spoke, he started asking me, barely a minute into it, started asking me those questions. David, what do you do? David, where do you live? David, what do you like to do? David, tell me about your family. And so we started off on that foot. And it turns out Scott and I are aligned in a lot of things outside of music too, which certainly helps our conversations. I think we are aligned from a belief system level and from a lot of other things too. So I think we sort of hit it off from that standpoint. And from there, and Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you and I spoke at least 3 or 4 times about obituary, and maybe for a fraction of those calls, we just didn't even talk about obituary. We just talked. And so that's Scott and I built a pretty immediate rapport. And so from there, once the obituary book wrapped, Scott had been approached by Tim Hubbard, to which this book really may not have been possible without, because Tim was the go-to photographer back in the late 80s, early 90s for all the labels. There were no quote unquote death metal photographers back then. Tim was the guy, and Tim and Scott go way back through high school. And when a band would come down and say Monty Connor from Roadrunner would need a photo session, Monty would ask Scott. Scott would say, "Hey, I have my buddy Tim. Tim could shoot you guys and he could do a great job and it won't be very expensive." So voila, like all those great pictures you see of Deicide and Obituary and Death and Sepultura, that was Tim Hubbard. So Tim had approached Scott about doing a book about Scott's recollections from that era combined with his pictures. And lo and behold, the obituary book is a wrap. And Scott hits me up probably a little bit after I had turned it in and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing a book. Would you be interested in helping me?" And of course I said yes, based on the fact Scott and I had hit it off so well and he seemed like an easy guy to work with. And then Scott my first thought was, okay, we'll just go with all the the huge bands that Scott did, the bands everyone knows about, the bands, Adrian, you had mentioned, the Deaths, Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Suffocations. Then Scott turns around and goes, "No, if we're going to do a book," and this is the famous line that he gave me, "I don't want to be that guy walking down the street and have one of my bands who I record and say, 'Hey, Scott, I see there's a book about you, but my band's not in it. How come?'" And, to Scott, that would be a terrible thing to happen. So Scott had politely requested that I try and track down every band that he recorded. And so I think in the book we have 69 bands, I want to say. But if the unofficial count of Scott Burns' projects may be anywhere from 80 to 90 or possibly even 100 bands that he did over time. So that's sort of, and I took it on as a challenge. It's like, there are not too many books like this, right? There are not that many books told from, it's really an oral history, right? It's not told from my standpoint. It's told from Scott and his band's standpoint. I thought that made it sort of a unique twist on the book. And so once we had sort of figured out what the format would be, and we had Tim's photographs to help us along and the support of Decibel, we were off and running. I think we started probably 2 years ago around this time, I want to say.